Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Well, we're coming up to the new year, end of the old year, beginning of the new year. This is on one level, it's pretty well meaningless. It's just a turning of the odometer numbers past zero. But psychologically, it does have an impact, I think, on people. It's the beginning of the new year, 1st of January. January is named after Janus, the Roman god of boundaries, a two-headed looking both directions. And this is kind of a liminal moment, a boundary moment when we're looking back at the past and we're looking forward into the future. So I thought it might be a good time to revisit a topic I have talked about before, which is time, the passing of time, meaning of time. There's many different reflections we could make on the nature of time. To begin with, there's the question whether time actually is real, whether it has any meaning. And this is a topic or a issue that was controverted amongst the schools of early Buddhism, was the nature of time. The Sarvastivada school, which was very influential school in India, held that past, present, and future all exist. Time is, in a sense, an illusion. And that view would actually accord with some interpretations of modern physics looking at time, that time is only a conventional or an abstract concept. And under this view, we perceive time because of the limitations of our consciousness, processing one moment after another sequentially. Whereas viewed in this way, time is merely another dimension, like length, breadth, and width. That all of reality is existent, but we only perceive one moment after another. So that's a Sarvastivadin approach to nature of time. There's also there's a Tibetan text, the Yoga of the Three Times, that says the past is unreal because it has utterly ceased to exist. The future is unreal because it is not manifest. And the present is unreal because it cannot be fixed. This is also another conundrum or paradox. If you're trying to look at the present moment, it's always slipping into the past. In the Theravada Abhidhamma, there is a concept of time as having a nature of discrete moments. So it's kind of a quanta of time. This is something else that has a parallel in modern thinking, in that there is a smallest possible unit of time, the Planck moment, in modern physics. And in Theravada Abhidhamma, there is a definite discrete moment, smallest possible unit of time. But in the Theravada, though, it isn't so much a physical concept as a psychological one, that our minds perceive the objects, the stream of objects, as discrete moments, discrete units of time. So our psychological or subjective reality is kind of like those films before they were digitized in the old days when they had a reel of film. It was a sequence of still photographs, and there would be so many per second that would go past the projector, and it fools the eye and the mind into seeing continuous action, but it's really a stream of still photographs proceeding very rapidly. And according to the Theravada Abhidhamma, this is how the mind works, the human mind. We perceive discrete moments so quickly that we blur them together, and we have a sense of continuous motion. But the only ultimate reality in this view is the single moment, the absolute infinitesimal moment of time that anything exists. One of the core concepts of Buddhism is impermanence, that nothing abides, nothing persists. And this can be and should be looked at on different time scales. There's the scale of a human life, that we persist on this earth in a human form only for so many years and decades, and there's a limited time frame, and we're constantly, from the moment we're born, we're constantly changing and passing and moving at every moment, every breath. We're moving closer to the moment of death. And this is the impermanence of the human form. But also, impermanence can be seen on other time scales. One that's not often looked at, but it's fruitful to contemplate, is what could be called the geological or even astronomical scales of impermanence. Like if you drive into Thunder Bay, you'll pass, when you get close to town, you'll pass a range of hills called the Nor'westers. 200 million years ago, those were gigantic volcanic mountains. They were active volcanoes, and much taller than they are today. So what we look at, we see things like the hills, and we feel them to be like a permanent, like a bedrock of our environment, but they're actually changing all the time, but just on a time scale that is longer than a human lifetime. The continents are moving. Yeah. Europe and America are, every year, they're a few inches further apart. Continents are drifting. The sun is aging, and in some billions of years it will turn into a red giant, then cease to be. It'll burn out completely. And there's an anecdote, some of you have heard me tell this before, but there's some new people, so I'll inflict it on the old listeners again. Again, is a story that there's an astrophysicist was giving a public lecture, and he was talking about the life cycle of the sun, and he said how it's going to turn into a red giant and expand several times its size and boil away the inner planets and destroy all life as we know it, and then it'll collapse into a cold dead dwarf. And after the lecture, a woman in the audience asked him, "Sir, did you say that the sun is going to turn into a red giant in 7 million years or 7 billion years?" And he said, "Billion with a B." And she said, "Oh, thank goodness." But the real core of the idea of impermanence is looking at impermanence on a very small time scale, the momentary impermanence of all phenomena. This is also a view of Abhidhamma, that the only phenomena that we can call absolutely real is that which is present in the present moment, just for a flash, for an instant. And that any persistent form that we perceive, whether it's a human body or a mountain or whatever, is really, if it was seen on a minute scale of time and space, it would just be atoms of matter flashing in and out of existence, flickering, that nothing persists for more than a moment. So one of the statements in the Abhidhamma is that motion is impossible, that what we perceive as motion is really just subsequent arising in adjacent locations. That any ultimately real, a Dhamma of ultimate reality, it only it doesn't change or adapt or move. It just flashes in and out of existence at a single location. And this time scale is extremely brief, minute. And in meditation, doing Vipassana meditation, we're trying to get closer and closer to the vanishing point of noticing single moments of consciousness. Trying to develop this very fine-grained perception. Ordinarily, we just perceive reality in big clumps. We don't perceive things on that very minute, fine scale. So this present moment is really the only thing that could be called actually real, an object and consciousness arising to the object. One thing that you'll notice if you contemplate this is that if you're in the present moment, there's no sense of self. That a sense of self, of an identity, an ego or a self-position, only exists with reference to the past or the future. If you take a self-position and identity, most often it's a reflection of your history. Like if someone asks you who you are, you'll tell them your name, which was from the past, was given to you as an infant, and maybe where you live and where you work and where you went to school. This is your identity is built up from your history. But in the present moment, who are you? And looking forward into the future, we create a self around a combination of hopes and fears. Right? We project into a future that's not yet manifest, it's unreal. And we create a self in that. But in the present moment, where are you? Who are you? Well, there's no ground to stand on. There's just this present moment experience. There's no identity there. There's just an object and consciousness. And with this coming of the new year, we're looking at the flowing of time and the passage of time in years and decades and centuries, the sense of history. And this is another reflection, is the different way the passage of time has been perceived culturally in the West and in the East. And I think this is very important for the whole psychology of the whole difference between the civilizations. In the West, going back to the Greeks, even further to the Sumerians, Babylonians. There is a sense of time as linear, that proceeding from an origin through a history that has consequences and development and proceeding to an end point. And of course, this was fleshed out and solidified with the coming of Christianity. You have, in the traditional Christian view, you have the creation of the world at a certain moment, and then a proceeding through history to an end point, an eschatology, an end of the world, of the book of Revelations, the second coming, and then the millennium. And this is very much, and still does to a large degree, shape the culture. In India, there was an entirely different conception of time as being cyclical, that things just keep turning round and round. There's no ultimate beginning, no ultimate ending. And so in this sense, history doesn't matter. So this is one thing you see, an interesting result of this, a significant result of this, is that dates in ancient Indian history are vague. We really are at a loss to make sense of in Indian history. Even the dates of the Buddha are very much disputed, because the Indians just didn't care about keeping chronologies, and it wasn't because they were too primitive. They were quite advanced in mathematics and medicine and many other fields. They were at least on par with the Greeks, if not superior to them in some respects. But they just never bothered with history or chronology. It didn't really concern them. So the first date that we can pin down with certainty in Indian history is the invasion of Alexander. And we have that from the Greek side. So everything else is quite vague, everything before that. There is a sense of repeated cycles. And there's different versions of this. I think it certainly goes back before the Buddha. I don't know how much the cycles are present in the Vedas. I think to some degree they are, but then later Hinduism, you have the yugas, Kali Yuga, and so on. The Buddhist version is quite explicit in stating that there is no ultimate beginning. The Buddha himself said that the beginning of things is not to be apprehended. And later Buddhist commentators were quite explicit in saying there is no beginning. There was no point of creation. There was no first origin. In other words, it's infinity in both directions. As far as you go back in time to any moment x, there'll be an x minus 1. And this is a logical necessity, given that the principal axiom of Buddhist philosophy, one of the principles of Buddhist philosophy it's based on, is the principle of causation, that nothing exists without a cause. So it's impossible to say that this first moment exists, because then it would be uncaused. So, the theist says, well, God created it, but then the Buddhist would say, well, where did God come from? There has to be a cause. So there can't be a first cause. This rules out the possibility of a first cause, because you go back to the first cause and then you have to look at the cause before that. Yeah? So there's a sense of endlessness in both directions. That's the first principle. But there's also the limited cycles, and there's cycles within cycles on different time scales. But there is, for any given world system, there is a beginning and an ending. This is not the whole cosmos, but for any given, in modern terms, a planetary system, but in ancient terms, a Chakrawala, a world wheel of the world, a world system, has a beginning, development, and an ending. And within that, there's also cycles within human history. In the mythology or the cosmological vision of the ancients, there was a cycling of human lifespans, morality, and prosperity, and the peak of human existence, which has happened many times in the past and will happen again in the future, at least one more time, is quite fantastic. That the human lifespan is 80,000 years. And because of increasing immorality, the lifespan decreases. The story is given that the first beginning of this was there was a world ruler, a Chakravarti, a righteous ruler named Dharmani, who ruled righteously, and everyone lived 80,000 years in happiness and prosperity and peace. And he had a successor and another successor, and there were 7 generations, each of 80,000 years. And then the last one in this sequence did not keep the duties of a righteous ruler perfectly. The one thing he neglected to do was to look out for the welfare of his people. And some of the people began to suffer from poverty and lack of resources. And some of those took to robbery. So the king, never having seen theft, having never previously existed amongst humans before, the king was at a loss what to do, and he apprehended this fellow, and he says, "Well, why did you steal?" He says, "Well, I had nothing." He says, "Well, here, take some wealth, go on your way." Give him a bag of money. And of course, that didn't work. Because the word got out. The king will give you money if you steal. So crime became more prevalent. So now the king said, when he caught somebody, he said, "Well, we're going to have to make an example of this one. So march him out of the city gates by beat of drum and then cut his head off." And so then the people became alarmed that the king was cutting heads off, and they picked up swords and shields and took to armed banditry and fighting. And so violence appeared in the world. And with the direct result of the lack of morality, lifespans began to decrease, from 80,000 years to 40,000, 20,000, 10,000, so on. And there's a long list of the different immoralities that people committed to, from stealing and violence and lying and disrespect of elders and sexual immorality. And in the end, the lifespan dwindles. And at the Buddhist time, in the text, they give the lifespan as 100 years. And nowadays it's actually somewhat less than that. And there's a Burmese tradition that the lifespan actually decreases 1 year per century. So we're seen in this model or vision, we're seen as being on the downslope now, right? And near the end, we're down in the tail end here, but we still have a ways to go, because the very last, the very bottom of the downslope, human lifespan will be 10 years. And it says the women will be fertile of childbearing age at 5, and the whole lifespan will be 10. And people will basically revert to an animal-like existence. And the very bottom will be 10 days of what they call the sword time, when people go mad and just attack each other randomly. It's like, oh, everybody just goes crazy with violence. And most of the human race is wiped out. But there are few survivors that manage to hide, and they come out and they discover each other and they make a pact to not kill anybody anymore. And just by not killing, by taking up that first precept of not killing, lifespan begins to increase again, and you're now on the upslope. And every generation they take on more rules and morality until they're back to 80,000 years. And it's also, this cycle has some variance. It depends on the principal defilements of the people in that age. And it's said that this cycle, the defilement of anger is predominant, or ill will is dominant, so we're going to end up with a sword time. But if greed is the ultimate, is the primary defilement, then it ends up in a great famine, and people starve. And if confusion is the prominent defilement, it ends up in a plague. But in any case, almost everybody's wiped out. It's the bottom of the cycle. Then the next cycle goes up back to 80,000 years. And at the end of this coming cycle, at 80,000 years, is when the next Buddha, Mattaya, is supposed to come. He's supposed to appear in the world at that time. So that's however you count it, it's a very long ways away in the future. And in an entire world system, one text says there's 20 of these up and down cycles. But then in the world system then comes to an end and is destroyed. And there's cycles within cycles here too, because this cycle we're in now is one that will end by fire. The end of the world will come when a second sun appears in the sky, and then a third, a fourth, a fifth, up to 7 suns, and it dries up all the oceans and burns everybody, and just destroys the whole world, and everything burns up. And there's a long period of just emptiness in this region of space, and then a new world appears and begins its second occurrence. Some cycles end by water, by gigantic floods that just drown everything. And some end by wind, giant windstorm that blows everything to pieces. And there's no conclusion to this. This just continues on and on without respite. It's coming into being and passing out of being. And this is on all scales. We look at the individual mind moments, there's coming into being and passing out of being. And you look at a human lifespan, it's coming into being and passing out of being. And you look at a world system, it's coming into being and passing out of being. So this is all endlessly churning over and recycling. So we look to the passage of time, and hopefully as we pass through this existence, the accumulation of our experience allows the arising of some wisdom. Wisdom is said to be the one faculty that increases with age. Strength and beauty and everything else that falls away diminishes, but wisdom increases. Just by the experience of living, there's some degree of wisdom arises, but we can get deeper wisdom if we practice the right way, and particularly with right attention. Yonaso Manisakara, right attention. Now, when we have various experiences, phenomena arises in the mind, and objects are seen and things are done, we can attend to them in different ways. There's ayonaso manasakara and yonaso manasakara, wise and foolish attention. Now, if we pay attention to phenomena informed by our desires and our fears and our negativities and our confusions, that's wrong attention. And it's observing certain signs and particulars. Right? Like we pick out things out of the whole matrix of reality. The mind chooses what to look at. And if it's based on desires and fears, then that's going to not encourage wisdom. That's going to encourage more confusion and more being caught in the delusion of becoming. But if we pay attention with wise reflection and see things, particularly seeing them according to the Dhamma, means seeing according to the three characteristics, seeing them as imperfect or suffering, seeing them as impermanent, transient, the flash in the pan, changeable, and seeing them as ultimately empty, void, without a self-existence, without a self-substance. If things are seen in this way, their nature is penetrated, and the mind is liberated, and wisdom dawns. Move toward greater wisdom. So this means seeing with equanimity and seeing with clarity and without attachment or aversion, with a non-judgmental eye, the seeing things in their own nature as they actually are, not being swayed by desire, not being swayed by preconceived ideas, by theory, but just by the nature of things as they actually are. This is the essence of vipassana. This is clear seeing. This is what's really meant by sati, of mindfulness, is just this, just being present with the reality as it is. And it's easier said than done. It takes training, and it takes some internal fortitude. It takes a certain courage, a certain warrior kind of spirit to be able to sit in that storm and be clear and calm and centered. The mind has a tendency to want to retreat to its familiar delusions, to its the false security of the near shore. Whereas looking at things clearly with that right reflection and without grasping and without seeking, this takes a tremendous amount of courage. It's stepping into the abyss. It's like crossing a body of water, like a creek. And I had this experience in Thailand of crossing a creek of water. It was on my path every day, and mostly it was pretty small, like ankle deep. But after a monsoon rain, it would fill up. This little ravine would fill up with raging water, and there'd be a torrent that would be like waist deep in a torrent of water. And it took 3 steps to get across. It was that wide. And the first step was no problem because you could hang onto a branch on the near shore. And the third step was no problem because you could grab a branch on the far shore, but you had to take one step without any support. And doing that in the mind is even more difficult because you do not as yet perceive that there is a far shore. You have to step out. You have to let go of the near shore to make that passage, make that crossing. So I've rambled around about the whole universe, and we'll leave it at that.
Hantamayam Dhammakataya Sadhu Karam Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami